Watch Doors of Perception, now on Amazon Prime.
I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is. Eventually people are going to say, what the hell is going on? It's not enough to say it's nuts, you have to explain why it's so nuts. The invention of artificial life, the cloning of human beings, possible contact with extraterrestrials, the systems which are in place to keep the world sane are utterly inadequate to the forces that have been unleashed.
Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Today my guest is Phoenix Aurelius. First, be sure to watch Doors of Perception. That's available right now on Amazon Prime. Also, visit our website, forbiddenknowledge.news. It's the home of the Forbidden Knowledge Network, where we feature some of your favorite podcasts and content creators. Be sure to download all our podcasts directly through Spreaker if you listen through any podcast provider. We are booking guests for June and July. If you have suggestions or you'd like to be a guest, email me, forbiddenknowledgenews@gmail.com. Today I want to welcome back to the show Phoenix Aurelius. He is a philosopher, alchemist, spagyrist, agriculturalist, teacher, and the founder of the Phoenix Aurelius Research Academy. Phoenix, welcome back. How you doing?
Hey, thanks so much for having me again. Yeah, I'm doing great. How about you, man?
Excellent. Really looking forward to our discussion. Today we're going to be exploring the darker side of magic, curses, hexes, dark entities, and even possessions. Having guests like yourself over many years exploring these topics with the limited understanding I have, I do understand that magic is a tool and that your intention behind it will have a powerful effect on the outcome. Now, that being said, there are most likely many individuals and groups that utilize magic for not so good purposes, which we'll be discussing a little bit today and some of the rabbit holes that can branch off from there. But it's been a while since you've been on. Remind the audience just a little bit about yourself and let them know where they can find you.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, I am a practicing alchemist and esotericist. I run the Phoenix Aurelius Research Academy. You can find my work at phoenixaurelius.org. It's really quite broad in terms of the things that we research and what we do, because we pick up Paracelsian kind of ideas, which kind of are a multi-dimensional approach to health and wellness. And so everything from things that affect the spirit and things that affect the soul to things that affect the body are all kind of incorporated inside of this kind of system of medicine. And because there's been so many different adaptations to the work that Paracelsus has had, just over the 500 or so years since he's been dead, we've actually started calling the entire corpus of medicine that we're reconstructing Aurelian medicine, because it kind of goes into all of the things that we have found and other things that have been discovered since the time of Paracelsus. It wouldn't do Paracelsus justice to call what we're doing Paracelsian medicine anymore, because there've been so many more additions to it. So,
right on.
yeah.
Great introduction. Now, as it relates to what we're going to be getting into today, would you say that you've noticed an increase in the more darker practices of magic?
Yeah, definitely. So, we here in the United States, we kind of have to look at different time periods in order to really understand influx of magic and specifically of darker magical practices. It became very, very popular in the late 1970s and early 1980s to get into the works of like Aleister Crowley, for instance, which some of the works that Crowley has are not really necessarily that dark, but then many others are, because they're just self-fulfilling. A huge part of the law, if the lemma, do what thou wilt, shall be the whole of the law. A lot of people follow that part and not always taking into consideration the latter half of that, which is love is the law, love under will. So with that being said, a lot of people tend to do things that are very self-serving and to put themselves into certain situations. And this began to be very, very popular in the late 70s, especially, we even had artists like Led Zeppelin, who were getting very much so into Crowley's work and had even purchased and recorded in Crowley's house in Scotland. And some crazy, heinous things have happened in that house, in the exploration of magical prowess. But in the 1980s, here in the United States, we went through this entire period called the Satanic Panic. And this was really because of a surge of popularity of LaVey style Satanism, which LaVey even says that in his cosmology, Satan as an entity does not necessarily exist, but Satanism instead is an aggrandization of the desires of the self. And even inside of that book, he ends up telling people that, ultimately you're going to have to guide yourself by your own system of ethics. I think it was either him or other folks that I was in that vein of for a while that ended up saying that morals are overrated, but ethics are absolutely necessary. And when somebody steps over their own ethical boundaries in order to aggrandize their own sense of self-power, this is really where you step over the line. And in the context of using magic, this is where you step over the line of performing what would otherwise be neutral magic or healing magic or white magic or any of these other kind of labels that people place on things, and you start stepping into the darker aspects of things, which is all about aggrandization of the self and aggrandization of what it is that you want, regardless of whether or not it's ethical, whether or not it's really useful or whatever. And I think that, ethical practitioners ultimately come to the concept that, I wouldn't want to steal from local stores. Why? Well, because that's not just going to hurt the store, that's going to increase prices for everyone. It's going to hurt the community. When the community is hurt, that also hurts you yourself. So what goes around comes around. You start to notice these patterns of karma if you're aware of what you're doing over time. And the same is true with the paths of left-hand tantra, from the Indian or the Vedic type of perspective. It's the exact same thing. You begin to notice that no matter what you do, if you're really aware of it, you begin to see these kind of cycles of karma, or these cycles of doing is really what karma means, that end up impacting us negatively if we're putting negative or self-serving energy out there. And so, yeah, that's kind of a big part of it. But in the 1980s, we had a huge satanic panic type of thing where Christians were very up in arms about people practicing Satanism. And, there's a lot of people, even Crowley himself, delighted when people would call him the beast. And he often referred to himself as that. He just got such a kick out of that. And, there's a lot of people that are out there with that same type of underdeveloped, it's like a heavily emotionally traumatized soul that ends up compensating for that by feeling that they can turn to occult or unseen powers to gain leverage over other people or over society. And they use it in a very petty way, typically. So that would be mostly black magic. But yes, it's definitely on the rise. Why? Because the traumas are on the rise. The more traumatized an individual is, the more self-serving they become out of a natural state of preservation. And there are many people to whom unseen forces, whether those be entities or whether those be using occult knowledge, it's going to appeal to them to help to fill in these holes that they otherwise have as a result of all of this trauma. Or at least that's my own particular stance and take
Right
on
on. Since this is in part a conspiracy show, I'd love to get your thoughts on how much of this reemergence of dark practices could be linked to clandestine groups that are intentionally attempting to create culture and steer us in certain ways. The CIA was involved with Hollywood and our music industry to do just that, to steer society in a certain direction. But we also know that with MK Ultra and a lot of these other dark operations, that there was some occult ritualistic aspects involved. So I'm wondering how much of what we're experiencing has been somewhat intentional.
Well, yeah, very much so. It's been intentional. And even the CIA themselves actually admit to exactly what you were talking about. There are plenty of declassified documents, not just around the MK Ultra program, but also around their involvement in major motion pictures and other things, they still say that if there are major motion pictures that are going to kind of display any sort of events on a world stage, that the CIA must be involved in order to kind of help to dictate that narrative. So, um, yeah, they even agree that that's exactly what they're doing. Now, here's what most people don't realize is that most magic is really extremely common stuff that happens every day that people just have not looked at it under the lens as actually being magic. For instance, every time that you repeat something to yourself, you're performing a form of magic that is actually entraining the mind because the mind works with a system of variables. If you restrict your actions and your thoughts to a system of variables that are very narrow, then the likelihood of those things that are very narrow actually ending up happening or occurring is extremely high. And that's what a good magician of any sort will do is try to restrict all other variables by living life as a ritual to get to a point where what it is that they're looking at manifesting is essentially just a common reality because you've eliminated all other possibilities or all other potentials based on the way that you're channeling your own energy and your own behaviors and actions. But what that also means is that if you're sitting down and watching TV every day and you're listening to commercials every day, those are the things that you are hearing on repeat. If you're listening to the radio, if you're listening to the same songs, if you're listening to whatever, and especially if you're singing along to them, and especially if you're singing along to it or repeating it or recalling it somewhat mindlessly, those things actually put the brain into particular wavelengths and states of hypnosis that are used by ceremonial magicians and even folk magic practitioners in certain trance environments in order to program the brain in order to attain those particular desired states of consciousness. Now, when people are doing this unconsciously as a result of commercials, songs, etc., movie lines, whatever else, they think that what they're doing is actually connecting to the movie, connecting to maybe even the actors in it, connecting to the idea or the broader kind of egregore of that movie. But realistically, those things were very deliberately engineered in order to create addictions that keep you coming back to those things. And when people see like for instance, the dark sides or the esoteric sides of things, the occult, just in general has a lot of sex appeal because anything that you don't really know about, you can project your own fears, your own desires, your own whatever upon those things. And if it's not well known, you have carte blanche to kind of talk about these types of things without people saying, "Hey, bullshit, that's not actually real." And so there are a ton of people out there that actually do those types of things and put out and propagate a ton of ridiculous nonsense around it as well. But there are the actual forces in play, the occult forces in play that um, are really laws, and they can be used. A law is just a law. It can be used one way or it can be used another way. It really, the law doesn't care. It's just there is a law to be used. It really, like you kind of opened up with, depends on the intention of the person and what it is that they're looking at doing. And as it comes down to the CIA, as it comes down to larger governmental audiences, as it comes down to like the world stage, for instance, there is a lot of occult practice being used. And unless somebody has really gone full in, especially to the ceremonial magic path, and taken a look at various esoteric organizations and been involved in them, and take a look at the secret orders that get formed, we call them like orders within orders. And it's essentially like you may go to Blue Lodge of Freemasons, you may be a Freemason. Freemasonry itself is actually really awesome. It's a bunch of men getting together and trying to better the world by a deeper understanding, guiding their brothers and other things like that. A lot of people are just going to be there in order to meet other people who are interested in similar veins. They end up breaking off and kind of having their own, say, Tuesday night meetings or, Wednesday night meetings or whatever, where they're focusing more, say, on, more darker aspects or self-serving aspects or practicing sex magic or whatever else the case is. And you get some people doing some really heinous different types of magic as well, more in line with kind of like Babylonian sex magic and slave magic and money magic and other things like that that are more predatory. So I think that really it's just like coming to know what the esoteric laws are and then getting to know people and their traumas because that will almost always give you a clear indication of how they're going to channel that music or that magic if they don't process that trauma or if they're not interested in processing that trauma but instead reacting from a place of trying to overcompensate for whatever it is that they lack initially, which is usually power, a sense of fame, different types of things like
Right
that.
on. As it relates to the darker practices that we're seeing now during our modern times, I'm sure a lot of it has to do also with the access of information. There's a lot more younger people dabbling
Right.
in some of these occult magical practices. But what are some of the things that you've noticed that are resurging during this time?
Yeah, totally. Well, I think the big thing is that Wicca has kind of evolved in this really interesting way. From the 1950s until today, there's been a lot of kind of decharacterization of the original tenets of Wicca, which was first, do ye no
Mm.
harm. And now these days, that's not really a thing. If you go on to the Instagram and TikTok witches pages and stuff like that, and you take a look at it, they commonly have memes that are like me when I first got into magic, and it's like somebody, praying for healing and casting spells for healing and rejuvenation, better sleep and, very innocent things. And then after a while, the next section of that meme will be like a woman dressed in black with like eyes rolled in the back of her head and doing, weird summoning magic in order to cast entities upon the enemies of that individual and other things like that. And you'll see very frequently memes that are very much so like that. And you'll also read a lot of things where people are talking about stuff like that. Cursing, hexing, jinxes, psychic attack, the evil eye, different things like that are definitely far more prevalent now than I think I've ever seen them ever before. And I've been tracking these things for over 20 years. So I think a lot of it too is that Christianity, in a lot of its capacity, has lost its appeal and stopped speaking to the younger audiences in a lot of ways. And so as they do that, they start turning towards what they would refer to as like the old ways. And you get into, without having a very good historical context of really what the old ways are, because Wicca is not the old ways. Wicca is like 1950s ways. Okay, it's about as old as your grandpa,
Yeah.
maybe as old as your father, or whatever. It's not. It's really not that old. But they end up getting into these types of things, thinking that these are older ways and serving, other gods or other entities. And a lot of people don't really know what they're doing or what entities are. Many people still have the perspective that entities that they would refer to as gods are actually gods. And I would have to disagree with that. In fact, all of the esoteric knowledge that we have from the 19th century occult revival onwards, and even somewhat before that, even going back to the 1700s, the 18th century, we can see that that viewpoint of actually worshiping gods was not really that common. Even when we're assuming a god form, what we're doing is connecting with the aspect of our psyche that is connected to that and acting like a tuning fork and taking that on in order to accomplish a very particular task. We are not actually communicating with an outside entity. And the reason is that if you contact an outside entity, that entity could be any number of beings. And usually, when you pray to these different types of beings, they are just astral tricksters who would love the opportunity to actually inhabit and possess your body because most entities, in fact, our definition at the Research Academy here of an entity is any electromagnetic signature that is aware of
Mm.
itself. And so many of these entities are just electromagnetic signatures. They would do absolutely anything to have the complexity of the piezoelectric fascial system, the biophoton system, the all of the different amazing electromagnetic technologies that come inherently built into the human multidimensional organism, and to be able to utilize that as a food source. And so many interdimensional entities and demons and other things, they prey on different emotional states or different resonance of thought. And so they can manipulate the neurological and endocrinological systems of the body in order to produce stress hormones or states of fear or states of like not well-being, feeling really shitty and things like this, because that is the type of food stuff that they have, and they end up farming us very much so the same way that we end up farming, say pigs or cattle or other things for their produce. And eventually when we pray to these other entities, the people on the other end of the phone, you can't see them usually, but they're responding and they will do things to help you earn your trust, especially initially. And then by the time that they've got you on lockdown, um, you're basically just being manipulated all the time. And that is where the real danger really begins. And so I think that a lot of it actually starts with a lot of the non-historical pagan groups in the modern day that are trying to return back to what they think are the old ways, but not doing it in a way where they understand that they are the gods entirely, and that every aspect of the brain actually contains various aspects of these godlike qualities. And it's not just the brain, too, it's just the dynamic human soul, which extends beyond the brain. But all of that really needs to be understood contextually and historically in order for people not to just go off and do stupid things like praying to other entities and feeling like, oh, they're definitely real because I asked for this and this thing happened. Just about any entity capable of electromagnetic manipulation is capable of doing those types of things for you. But whether or not you're actually getting the result that you want, which is a greater spiritual evolution, that's what we really need to be looking at. And instead, I see a lot of spiritual de-evolution or degradation inside of our society these days, as opposed to seeing a lot of spiritual evolution and
Now,
growth.
it probably also has a lot to do with them not taking care of childhood trauma or trauma in general and still having these negative emotional states and thoughts, and then getting involved with this stuff and still being in that state combined with a shitty education about magic in general. It's a recipe for
Yeah.
disaster, I would think.
Perfect
Yeah.
storm, perfect storm. Yeah. And it really does. I know so many people like to kind of poo-poo and look over that, but it really does go back to our chorus traumas. And if we're not taking a look at what these core traumas are and actually trying to address them and move past them, they remain one of our weak spots always. And everything that we do, whether it's in our love life and our personal relationships or business relationships or whatever else, it's constantly looking to um, kind of gloss over the emotional trauma and make it feel placated without ever actually addressing it. And in the past, a lot of people use drugs and alcohol. And of course, there's still plenty of drugs and alcohol out there. But the trend of using drugs and alcohol, especially among younger people, is going way down. So people aren't getting out of their bodies so much in the ways that they used to during the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. A lot of this now is people actually just doing really stupid things, out of desperation or out of some hope to gain character without building character. And I think that it's really important that people realize that in life, whether we're talking about the soul, the spirit, or the body, there really are no shortcuts. You put in the work, and what you develop is yours and can't be taken away from you. Whereas what you get from other entities or from magic is oftentimes very fleeting and causes you to keep coming back to that source that makes you feel like you have that power, which actually keeps you a slave. If you have to keep coming back to a master to imbue you with a property, then that's very much so a slave type of
Right
relationship.
on. I'd like to explore a little deeper some of the darker practices that you mentioned earlier that are somewhat having a resurgence, like curses, hexes, jinxes, spells. Maybe go through these and give us the differences and help us understand what these are really are.
Sure, yeah. So there are somewhat different schools of thought around this, but at the Phoenix Aurelius Research Academy, what we do is we try and take all of the data that we can, and then we subject it to intrinsic data field investigations, and then also pull up historical cases and try to create the most consistent definitions that we possibly can. So that's where my own particular definitions are going to come from here. With that being said, curses, they can definitely be combined with a ritual component, although not usually. A curse is something as simple as you thinking about somebody or, holding the idea of somebody in your mind while you literally curse them out. It could be as simple as saying like F that person, they really suck, or it could be really something like I hope they die or I hope they get hit in the head with a baseball or whatever the case is. Those are the types of things that that are categorized as curses. And so they can definitely have um ritualistic components. They can definitely be combined with various mudras like the crooked finger. They can be combined with many other things, but usually curses, when we look at that from an Aurelian medicine perspective, are not usually sent by high level practitioners. They're sent by everyday people who are thinking of you, who you have done people wrong or they perceive that they've done you wrong, and then they're trying to use some sort of invisible or esoteric wavelength to be able to
Now, what
retaliate,
kind of effects
essentially.
would that
And so,
have on someone?
yeah, well, it can have a wide range of different effects depending on the severity of the curse and what the intention of the curse was. So if somebody says, F that person, probably not a whole lot, right? I mean, you may or may not actually really get that much. But if somebody is specifically throwing a curse at you and using any sort of level of ritual with it, in order to, enhance its magnetic capacity, then that could even lead to severe sickness. It could lead to being bedridden. It could lead to getting in accidents and things like that. Although at that point, when we talk about accidents and not just some negative form of magic actually hitting you, now we're kind of blurring the line between where a curse ends and where a jinx begins. And so, yeah, we'll get into that here in a minute. But yeah, so curses can have all sorts of different types of impacts on us. And from a health perspective, what it does is it always causes the soul to shine less brightly. So the soul in Aurelian terminology and just within broader Paracelsian and alchemical lens is the aspect of us that is all of our personality, the way that we come across. It's our entire psyche. In fact, the Greek word psyche means soul, and that's where we get our word for psyche. It's spelled exactly the same way. So essentially, our soul needs to have a certain level of brilliance to it in order to really manifest, or in order for us to attain any sort of level of individuation. And the less individuation that we have, the more monotonous we become, and the more just part of a group that we are, and the less individual that we express ourselves as, the less unique we are. So curses will always, diminish the brightness of the soul, regardless of how intense they are. But like I said, some of them can actually make you very, very sick and very, very ill, or have very heinous things that end up happening to you.
Right on.
So that would
All
be a
right.
curse.
What about hexes?
Yeah, so hexes are almost always a high level practitioner, or at least a decently trained magical practitioner that is utilizing some sort of ritual component on you in order to hex you. And a hex is very much so like a curse, but it always has some sort of retaliation type of component, like you did this to me, or you made me feel like this, and therefore I make you feel 10 times
Wow.
worse. And there's almost always an order of magnitude of difference between the perceived offense towards the magical practitioner and the way that they choose to retaliate. So it's not just like, you know, you hurt me and so I want to hurt you same exact level. That's usually not what ends up happening. It's like you pulled me over and gave me a ticket, so now I'm going to hex you so badly that you will lose your firstborn son or your firstborn child, and you will, it's like orders of magnitude of difference. And this again comes from most individuals that um it's like, oh, you want to fuck with me, huh? Well, then let me show you what
Yeah.
I'm capable of, type of stuff. And they'll use any sort of unseen advantage that they can gain over people in order to exact some form of justice or some self-perceived sense of justice, no matter how skewed it is. Hexes almost always have some sort of spell work component to them, so they oftentimes will, at the very least, use a rhyme
Mm.
scheme inside of there. Very frequently, though, we will also see some sort of ritual component, so like bindings and other different types of things in order to prevent people from hurting you and other things like that. We will oftentimes see, cord wrapping or other, the use of dolls, even sympathetic magic with the use of dolls and pins or fire or whatever else. And so these can be very, 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 very damaging to individuals, and they end up creating extreme pains. They end up creating entire, you know, like life falling apart, different types of effects on people. Generally, if somebody tests very high when we perform an intake on hexes, their story of like their health symptoms or other things is like it wasn't just health, it was like they lost a family member, and then they lost another family member, and then they lost their dog, and
Wow.
then they lost other things, and it just like completely emotionally shattered them to the point where they're at a state of psychosis now, and it just kind of perpetuated, perpetuated, perpetuated. Those are the types of things that we see with hexes, is like severe, severe problems that end up occurring. So that's that
Right on.
one.
Well, you mentioned spells. Is it necessary that they have a component of rhyming in order to work? Okay.
No. No. So historically, when we go into rhyme scheme, when we go into the use of meter, which is a poetic type of tool that is used, various different cultures, various different languages have all different sorts of meters. And of course, most people, when they hear about meter and in the English language, if they even remember it at all, they would go back to Shakespeare and the use of iambic pentameter, for instance, right? Well, most of the spells that you see are really, really poorly done, and they rhyme extremely poorly, and it's just like ultra simple type of rhyme scheme. That is not actually necessary, but that is a type of spell known as an incantation. And an incantation typically has meter with it, which is what makes it a cant or a shant or a shanty or a
Mm.
song. It has a type of meter to it, and oftentimes will have some sort of rhyme scheme accompanying it. Most people are not high enough level practitioners to perform very good incantations these days. There are only a couple of groups that I know of that really work with incantations, and primarily they're not the ones that are going to be casting negative or harmful spells on people either. Typically, modern day druids, especially of the Welsh and of the Irish Reconstructionist version, go back into the literature of what we have as an extant literature from the bards in order to understand the different types of rhyme schemes that were used during the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age periods, and then being able to try and reconstruct these or even translate them into English without losing too much of those rhyme schemes. So spells themselves are usually just written out, and that's why it's considered a spell. An incantation is something that usually has a rhyme scheme to it, or some form of meter. And there are other different types of spells too. So, like for instance, a lot of people, like when they try to manifest money, they might say something like light a candle and be like, you know, uh, please let it be that money comes to me three by three. That's what I mean. I mean, like incredibly stupid, poor rhyme schemes that you get. But again, the rhyme scheme isn't necessarily as important as how the practitioner feels about it, because if the practitioner feels that that was a really potent work for them, then they may actually get really potent results.
Mm.
So the body of the spell or the body of the incantation is actually somewhat less important than the way that 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 action, that scheme, that body made the practitioner feel. Because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do with magic is to take a thought or an image and couple it with an emotion in order to create a feeling. The stronger the feeling is, the the stronger the particular magical working is going to be. Everything else is really just there as either a sympathetic magic or as something that is a ritual to work the person into a state of mind where that feeling is very, very strong and concentrated.
You mentioned jinxes. What's the difference with jinxes?
Yeah, so jinxes are a very, very interesting thing, and they are extremely common in Pan-African traditions. So Santeria, Voodoo, Hoodoo, Obeah, different types of traditions like this. And a jinx is basically where everything that you try to do just goes wrong. So let's say that, you're at work and you're up for a promotion. If somebody casts a jinx on you, not only are you gonna not get that promotion, but you're probably also gonna get fired. And then on your way home from getting fired, you're probably going to get into a small wreck. And then not only are you going to get into a small wreck, but maybe your vehicle registration just barely expired or something. And so you get a ticket for that. And then not only do you get a ticket for that, but then something else happens. It's usually a chain where absolutely nothing will go right for you. And so there are some crossovers, of course, between curses and hexes, but with jinxes, we particularly see that things are not going right and that you're constantly losing, despite doing things the right way, despite building up your spiritual energy and your discipline to be able to attain those things. It's like something somewhat otherworldly seems to be impacting you negatively over and over and over to drive things in an opposite direction than what you would, what is even ideal for your survival. And so, like I mentioned, jinxes are usually done with some sort of stipulation, but not always. So the stipulation would be until this person recognizes and apologizes for the troubles that they caused me, or until they pay me back for the problems that they caused me, then everything will go wrong for that person. The trick is that in the past with jinxes, especially in African traditions, you were meant to contact the individual and tell them how they had wronged you and what they need to do in order to make it right with you. In modern day, there is no such chivalry
Wow.
involved. It is you just cast a jinx on somebody and they don't know the contiguous stipulation that goes along with it. And so, how could they ever possibly break it, or how could they even know who it was that they harmed? And a lot of people that get into these different types of Pan-African traditions, and of course, jinxes do exist in other types of magic, especially the Thai occult is really big in jinxes as well. So it exists all over the world, but usually there is some sort of cultural understanding that you are supposed to let that person know that they hurt you and how they hurt you and what they need to do in order to break it, and then you perform the spell or you hire the person to perform that jinx or whatever for you. And these days we really don't have that. Nobody is letting you know, hey, it was me who's doing this for one, and here's why I'm doing it. So it becomes particularly difficult for a lot of people to even know that they're jinxed. But the telltale characteristic would be everything in your life continues to fall apart in a way that seems completely, like I mentioned earlier, completely
Now,
otherworldly.
something else you have in your talking points along those lines are psychic attacks. What would be the difference
Right.
between that and what we were just discussing?
Yeah, so psychic attack uses more of just the psychic nature of things. There's not really any sort of ritual to it. There's not really any sort of sympathetic magic kind of going on. So a psychic attack is where somebody might just think of you and see terrible things happening to you, and they are capable of looking at that with such an intensity that they can actually cast that upon your intrinsic
Oh,
data
wow.
field as an individual. And so you end up carrying around all of this really negative information in your informational field about bad things happening to you, or getting really ill, or other different types of things like that. So as you can see, like, a lot of these share a common thread in that they're often designed to hurt or to harm another individual. There's some sort of negative, harmful, malicious, malevolent, ambivalent, or evil aspect to it. But psychic attack, more often than not, is not done by high-level practitioners who have studied, let's say, remote viewing and various different psychic arts. They're oftentimes just done by people who are very psychically gifted, who may not understand the scope of their powers. They feel slighted, hurt, abused, whatever, by a particular individual. And then they end up just like, involutionarily viewing that person as bad things happening to them. And they may not even really truly understand what the scope of their impact actually is, but they're constantly sending that information to the individual that they're focusing on. And so it's definitely a form of magical prowess that ends up having negative effects on the individual, but not necessarily with a ritual
Right
component.
on. Now, I definitely want to get to how we can protect ourselves from all these dark practices, but first, I want to get deeper into entities, how they affect us, and
Yeah.
to the extent of how they can infiltrate our consciousness up to what people understand as possession.
Cool. Yeah, this is a really great thing. So within the Aurelian um, kind of philosophy, we have three different types of entities that, if we were to like really separate them out, that we need to take a look at. The first, and probably the most common and most commonly misunderstood as well, are demons. And demons are a particular classification of interdimensional entities, meaning that they can move in between dimensions, but their interface with us, like most entities, is through the electromagnetic interface. And humans, being very multidimensional, of course, we have physical bodies, but we also have electromagnetism running through us. And this is what we refer to as the astral body, or the astral dimension, anything where thoughts and emotions are really active, is what we define as the astral. Anything that is electromagnetic is also the way that we would define the astral. So, demons are a particular classification of entities that particularly feed on fear and deprivation. So, the more that a person buys into a state of fear, that is kind of like, when we talk about viruses from a virology perspective, they talk about these entry mechanisms. Well, the entry mechanism for demons is definitely fear. And so they will do anything that they can to perpetuate or to aggrandize a sense of fear in the individual, because then they can make their way into the individual. And again, they're just there to try and find food stuff. They're just farming. They're just particular types of entities. I can't particularly say that they're good or evil. I don't really view things in those non-dual ways. It's just that um, from a conventional perspective, you could say, "Oh, wow, that looks like a real evil
Yeah.
entity." But again, that's just their perspective of life and of existence, is that they feed on fear, and so they have to perpetuate fear. Um, in some cases, it's abundantly available in certain locations, like hospitals, graveyards, different types of areas where people have said, like, oh, wow, I picked up a demonic entity when I was doing this thing in these locations. And so, various different types of areas that are prone to fear and pain and suffering are going to have disproportionately higher levels of these entities, because there's an abundance of that food stuff for them. They have an abundance of their material to eat.
Hmm.
So, yeah, demons, though, are not as tricky as the Christian mythologies want them to appear. Oftentimes, Christianity ends up using forms of exorcism that call upon the Christ. And in my experience, that pisses demons off more actually than it does get rid of them. And in fact, even if you take a look at the Roman Catholic Church and their exorcist rituals and rites, one of the things that they also acknowledge is that an exorcism should only ever be done if it is absolutely mandatory and falls within these particular criteria. Now, there are some rogue priests and other denominations that will go out and still perform the Latin forms of exorcism. But the reason why they do that, and why they say that it needs to be done under these particular criteria, is that those are the criteria that that particular form of exorcism is going to work for. Everything else is probably just going to piss it off. And realistically, you can only go so far with demonology within a Christian context before you realize that most of what it is that they're doing, saying, praying, blessings, all these other things, are not very effective, because the demonic activity, though it may subside for a short period of time, usually comes back with a vengeance. And anybody who's watched, like, even silly shows like Ghost Adventures or other things like that will know that whenever they bring people in who do these things and then they kind of follow up with the people, they're like, yeah, it was good for a period of time and then it got really bad thereafter. That happens very frequently. And that's because demons really just need to have that space where they can promulgate fear, and fear is one of the easiest things for the human being to generate, because anything that is unknown generates fear in the human organism, or can generate fear. It doesn't always. Sometimes it can, invigorate curiosity or other things, but more often than not, to your standard individual, not knowing about something creates fear. So demons are actually quite easy to work with. You do not need to get them out using the name of anything, really, besides tapping into the source of all creation and like basically putting on like a fear-free state of mind, fear-free kind of, if you wanted to think about it like that, it would be like a little bit of a spiritual bulletproof vest that just adds another layer of protection. And if you are very hard to farm, it's just like a location that, you would have to pull all of the rocks out of the field and, pull out big boulders, and your soil depth isn't very big. You're probably not going to want to buy that property in order to farm it. It's just way too much work. You'll go to another source that's much easier to get from. So that would be deep.
Now, how often would you say possession actually happens, and can it be from something other than what you consider a demon?
Yeah, absolutely. So it can also happen through other interdimensional entities, and other interdimensional entities will basically they try and feed on various different types of states of emotion, but not necessarily always on fear. Some of them on pain, some of them on suffering, some of them on fright, some of them on anger, some of them on, any sort of what we would refer to as lower vibrational kind of states of consciousness and emotional states of consciousness that keep the person generating cortisol and having some level of stress or anxiety. So interdimensional entities are very, very common. Of course, demons just being a categorization of an interdimensional entity, a very particular one. And then, of course, ancestral entities as well. So ancestral entities are entities within your bloodline that were never able to fully cross, either because they were not sung over to the other side in order to meet their own kin, or that died in highly traumatic and fast ways and not really able to even fully process that they were dead, or that, like, as cliche as it might sound, that there was quote unquote unfinished business or specific life goals that never got manifested. Those types of entities that exist within inside of our bloodlines oftentimes just wait for a particular individual who has a similar astrological resonance to them or personological resonance to them. So their interests are the same, their talents are more or less the same, etc. And then they'll kind of wait to kind of possess one of their family members as an opportunity to try and work out their own karma and move to the other side. That's not the way that they're actually going to get there, but nobody gave them the rules. They don't know how they're going to get there. In fact, they probably bought into religions like most people did that are so far away from a universal truth that they're very still stuck in that mode. So they're just trying to do anything they can. But it happens for us. We have two different types of ancestral entities that are problems. One are the malevolent ancestral entities, and those are ones that essentially held such different views to the views that you might hold during your life that they really hate you and they think that you're evil and they try to get you to do things that they would have done instead. And so you find yourself performing all of these things that are not really your real will and not really what you really want to be doing, but something that you feel is extremely familiar in another way. And that's because it's within your genes. It can be acted upon quite simply. And again, the sympathetic entry mechanism is the trauma. If you have a similar trauma to that family member, that's what allows that family member in as a malevolent entity. And then the same thing can happen, but with ambivalent entities. And I always tell people malevolence is so much easier to deal with than ambivalence, because if somebody is ambivalent towards you, at sometimes they can be your friend and very helpful. And at other times, the second that you do something they don't like, they can be your enemy and not very helpful, and you don't know which camp they really sit in. So it's harder to create a barrier against those types of individuals. But realistically, our ambivalent ancestors are ones that oftentimes have minor philosophical differences. Like, for instance, if one of your ancestors was a Presbyterian and then you choose to be a Catholic, they may not like that you're a Catholic. They may do everything that they could possibly do to prevent you from going further within, your holy rites or whatever else that you might get within the church or other things like that. And so it's going to be very, very specific and isolated instances in your life where you see that pop up, where it's like, I don't even know where this is coming from, type of thing. So anyway, these entities, we become very, very open to their presence primarily by not addressing our traumas or any of our core emotional wounds. Again, our wounds become like huge beacons to these creatures who are capable of feasting on the different emotions that are oozing from that wound, putrefying from that wound. And the more that we address these things, the less susceptible we become. That being said, there are some interdimensional entities that create these things called interdimensional implants, and people who are targeted individuals or people who deal with schizophrenia. I have yet to test a single one of them who is not testing positive in their intrinsic data field for interdimensional implants. And very frequently, in schizophrenia in particular, what they are looking for is not necessarily an emotional resonance. They're looking for a genetic resonance. They're looking for these particular mutations or polymorphisms that can exist within the C4A genes or the C4B gene groups. And when they see those, then they're just drawn to that like a beacon, and they install this interdimensional implant inside of the fornix. And what this causes is it causes the glutamatergic fibers of the fornix to be way super active. So you have tons of glutamate, which is an active excitatory neurotransmitter. And they're in the GABAergic fibers of the fornix, which are the calming and relaxing types of fibers. There's no activity. That implant completely suppresses their ability to produce GABA inside of the fornix. And this literally creates the susceptibility towards auditory hallucinations and hearing voices and other types of things like that, that otherwise a person, if they did not have those things, would not do. And there are definitely minerals that correspond to the fornix and fornix health, and heavy metals that can do that same type of thing. So where the genetic predisposition comes from for a lot of these individuals, we're still sorting that out, because there are some physiological factors that when we alter those, we can see that the schizophrenic potential and even the expression of the C4 genes tend to um, express themselves in a way that is non-pathogenic or non-susceptible to those types of entities. Whereas we still have plenty of other factors that we're trying to find where it's like, where is this coming from and how can we fully address it. But yeah, we've gotten at least enough through the research that we've been able to draw correlations over and over and over and over again with that fornix type of thing, C4A, C4B genes and stuff like that.
This reality is so much stranger than we could ever imagine. I love this stuff. Now, last few minutes we have, let's talk about how to prevent some of these negative things from occurring. I know we discussed taking care of trauma and emotional baggage. That's probably the number one thing we could do. But as far as
Yeah.
daily protection, if we are starting to work on those things, what would you recommend?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a whole slew of different interdimensional entities, including certain telluric entities as well. And so, telluric entities are a group that we didn't really discuss too much, but they they would oftentimes be conflated with the Seelie or unseelie courts in Scottish mythology, or the Fae, the fairy folk, the cryptids, different types of things like that. And sometimes they belong to geographic areas, and sometimes they really don't. But everything from like Yanalushi of Navajo tradition, which is, Skinwalker, or to the booger out here in Appalachia, or to, any of these other different types of things that were even presented in your documentary, Occult Louisiana, right? So, like, all of these types of cryptids are also entities, and we have to know and understand the way that they act and the way that they behave and their behaviors in order to understand what it is that they're attracted to or what they want from us and why we would be prey in the first place in order to protect ourselves. And that varies from each different type of entity, from entity to entity to entity type. So we kind of have to really study our lore in order to understand those
Well,
things.
I do
But
want to hear a little bit
as
more
a,
about this since you mentioned it.
okay.
These cryptid beings, why would you say that they present themselves to us? For example, Bigfoot or dogmen, do they have their own intentions behind making themselves known at times?
Well, I would imagine so. Most of yeah, there's some really, really interesting stories I've been reading, especially lately. Out here in Appalachia, some modern people will call it Bigfoot, but our local version of the Bigfoot is called the booger. And they would tell you that the booger is going to come get you. And when most people hear that today, they think, oh, the boogeyman or whatever. But then they see this huge ape-like hairy thing that can walk on all fours or stand up on twos and swing through the trees at like unreasonable speeds. We also hear about a lot of these different types of sensations with time storms. We hear about these with 411 missing cases. We hear about these with all sorts of different types of things. So oftentimes, my work with Michel de Vries actually has informed this opinion, but it actually seems that sometimes these entities are looking for food or have been deprived of food, and they actually feast on not our physical bodies, because more often than not, we go missing and they just return a single piece of us. Like, I remember reading this particularly
Huh.
interesting case of missing 411 in Yosemite, where the person went missing. They were gone for a long time, and people had seen, other hikers had seen something moving at like breakneck speed, swinging through the trees, causing the tips of the trees to actually bow down as it was moving. And they didn't know what it was, but they were far enough away from it that they thought it was weird, and they had heard a scream. Well, later there were CIA and FBI and other different secret services out there trying to find this individual that had been lost, apparently the source of the scream. And they searched around everywhere. I mean, everywhere that you could possibly imagine. Aerial searches with Black Hawks, on ground searches with Navy SEALs and with secret service agents and everything else. Couldn't find anything. 3 days later, somebody was hiking through the same area, and they happened to, in the middle of a river, on the big stone, find just the shoe with the severed human foot of that individual found right there. No other blood trails ever. No other clothes were ever found, still to this day. No other sources were found. It reopened the investigation. People went out there again, started looking for it, this time just trying to find a body. And even the way that the bone had been severed looked like it had been cut with like a laser or something. I mean, it was cauterized, it was completely sealed. There was like dried blood that looked like it had dried very, very fast under high heat situations. So when we take a look at things like this and we hear the types of descriptions, we don't always have an understanding of what it is that they're looking for. Now, Michelle DeVries and I did a lot of IDF investigations. She hired me to do IDF investigations for her doctorate of metaphysics and also for her master's of metaphysics degree before that. And what we found is that there are certain genetic components that are within, particularly our blood and bones, that are signals or antennas to various forms of interdimensional entities that give them permission. And there's three different major classifications of entities that are capable of kind of abducting us in cases that it's not actual government
Right.
stuff, because those are entirely different other things. There are crazy cryptids or cryptid likes, I should say, that are not interdimensional beings that are very freakish creatures that have been created by
Yeah.
governments and stuff too. Like we talk about the Montauk Project, or we talk, I mean, there's tons and tons and tons of different types of things out there like that too. But these ones that are not or do not appear to be government created by the fact that they also existed in Native American legends long before the, white settlers had ever arrived, we end up seeing that there is something that draws them to us that is like a beacon, and they have the ability to either abduct us and to take us for food, just like we would go and buy a license for hunting or fishing.
Wow.
We can do that. They have a license for that. They also have licenses for scientific investigation. So these are usually the cases where it's called catch and release. It's where you're caught for some time. You might be poked, prodded, studied, whatever, have these weird kind of vague memories of these things, and then put back. And then there might also be poaching. And we don't know what the purpose of the poaching is, but it appears as if it's for kind of the same type of thing, like human slave trade type of
Wow.
stuff, but from creatures to creatures. Like, wouldn't it be nice to have a lion, the pet? People might go in and poach a lion
Yeah.
and then be able to take it back and use it as a pet, and that they can do the same thing with humans. So from the best of our investigations at present, these seem to be the major realities that are happening, especially with what she calls the predator archetype, which could be any number of interdimensional entities that act predatorially towards the human
Wow,
organism.
that is crazy, man. All right, let's get to some protection practices, how we can
Okay.
maybe even become aware if we're being targeted in some way.
Yeah, totally. So the human organism has this very, very interesting capacity, and they've actually, I shared something about this on my personal Facebook maybe a week or two ago, where we have biophoton receptors that can tell if we're being watched or being observed. I think the most important thing is to try and activate those as much as you can through your daily practice and your meditation practices, etc. Just try and be aware of who is observing you, because you will be able to easily find, with a little bit of practice, 2 weeks of practice maybe, you'll be able to find as you're scanning your own energy field, like, somebody's taking a look at me. I can feel this. And if you allow yourself the ability to follow who is watching you, you can kind of make eye contact with them with your psychic senses. And that could be somebody who is placing curses, hexes, jinxes on you, or it could be an interdimensional entity who sees you as a potential food source. At that point, once you identify what the threat is, the idea really is, let me try to, make myself as non appealing as possible in terms of being prey. So a lot of times that comes down to, like, always carry a blade or a weapon with you, like always. If we talk about this all the time in terms of martial arts, and like women who are at higher, disproportionately higher susceptibility to being raped, almost all of them have an emotional trauma in their past that causes them to have low self-esteem. And that low self-esteem, coupled with fear of susceptibility to problems, is actually what attackers are looking for. They're not going for the most attractive, or they're not going for the one who's, wearing the skimpiest clothing. That's not what it is. It's the person who just oozes lack of confidence, who oozes the inability to really stand up or defend themselves in any way, shape, or form. So the first thing is get yourself a good blade, know how to wield it, and practice with it every day. That's going to actually, like, whether that's a physical threat or whether that's a non-physical threat. Because again, most of the telluric entities that we read about, particularly of Celtic and Brittonic and other different types of entities from Western Europe that we would refer to as Fae, Fairy folk, etc., which also are known for predating on humans and can use elf shot, fairy shot, etc. They hate an unsheathed steel blade that shows up over and over and over in all of the myths and all of the legends. So having one of those is a really good thing. Being able to utilize things that are able to manipulate the human biofield to such a degree where there is a type of cloaking that goes on is also a good thing. So traditional things like hag stones, which are stones that naturally have holes worn in them from water currents. Those seem to be extremely useful, and they can also be looked through in order to see things that you otherwise would not see with your own eyes. You'd be able to see with more metaphysical eyes. There are other different types of protections too, like wearing a Rowan cross or keeping a couple of Rowan berries on your person or hung up in the home, especially. So different types of things like that. But the thing is that unless you want to become an expert in these things and know the different types of entities, or, put a lot of time and effort into your own psychic development so that you can see which types of entities or people are harming you and what the mechanism is that they're harming you through. One of the best ways that we have developed over here is just to hire us to do an intrinsic data field analysis. And what we can do is look into your informational field and find out, are there curses, hexes, jinxes, psychic attack, the evil eye, harmful, negative, malicious, malevolent, ambivalent, or evil incantations or spells cast against you, and even the presence of telluric entities, which there's a different way of handling telluric entities than most other entities. We don't just banish telluric entities because that can have some really, really negative ramifications. We have to, oftentimes, they're trying to teach us, stay out of our area, you fucked with us. There's some sort of like recompense that needs to be made, oftentimes, with telluric entities to where you can create peaceable relations with them. Whereas with demons and other entities, you basically have to get them out. So we offer a service that will not only analyze you for these things, but then also eliminate them from the entire intrinsic data field. And this is, I've been trained in 15 to 17 different forms of ceremonial magic, ritual magic, folk magic, all sorts of things. I hold many different priesthoods and all sorts of different types of groups and this and that and the other. Even with all of that, I was able to perform IDF investigations on people after having performed some very elaborate, many hour, 8+ hour ritual exorcisms and things, and still find residual traces of these entities or curses in other people's spaces. And so I had other people from other traditions do the same thing. And then I would just perform an IDF investigation, on them as well. And what I found is that nothing actually works as well as clearing the informational field. So when I pop into their informational field, we balance and clear it and get rid of the susceptibility towards the possession of those entities, when we get rid of the susceptibility to the curses and the hexes, and when we actually banish them, when we put on consistent informational fields that will bind and mirror any of the individuals that have ever sent you curses or that ever will send you curses, as long as you continue wearing the talisman that we provide, then there's no susceptibility whatsoever to being impacted. So we do offer that service. It is quite time consuming for me, so it's a little bit of a hefty price, but because we're talking about it, Nori and I decided that to all of your listeners here at Forbidden Knowledge News, we want to offer a 20% off discount to the service for anybody who'd like to use it. Of course, if I test you and you don't have curses or entities in it, then we just refund your money. But if you do have it, then we end up doing that. So you can just go to our service. It's called Eliminate Ens Magicae, which means cause of disease due to magic. So Eliminate Ens Magicae and entities. It's an IDF service that we offer on our website. It's usually $400, but it's actually not 20% off. It's like $50 off. So you get it for $350 instead of $400, and the coupon code for that is forbidden.
Awesome. I'm sure my audience is going to love that. Thank you so much for that. Phoenix, this was fantastic information. We're going to have to revisit this and explore some different topics that we could get into. There's so much more we can. Before you go, one more time, let the audience know the best way they can find your social media content, website, all the good stuff.
Cool. So yeah, we're on Insta and on Facebook. You can find us at Insta. It's at phoenix.aurelius.alchemy. And on Facebook, it's Phoenix Aurelius Research Academy. You can also find us on YouTube the same way, Phoenix Aurelius Research Academy. We have all sorts of videos up there and other things. And then our website is the very best place to stay plugged into everything that we do. That's phoenixaurelius.org. And be sure to sign up to the newsletter for exclusive deals and news and coupons and all the other things that we're up to.
Excellent. Phoenix, thank you so much. We'll definitely do this again. Until next time, everyone, have an excellent evening. We'll talk again tomorrow. See y'all then.